The sun bore down with a merciless glare, flattening shadows and baking the earth until the air itself seemed to shimmer like glass. Along a dirt clearing carved out between the jungle and the river, a small line of Japanese women stood silently, their backs rigid, their heads bowed. Their uniforms, once crisp with regulation order, now clung to them in tatters, damp with sweat and salt from weeks of defeat. The cicadas screamed above them as if mocking their misery, their droning voices louder than any human could muster in such oppressive heat. Each woman clutched her fear as tightly as the few possessions left to her, threadbare satchels, rolled bandages, the memory of home that smelled faintly of tatami mats and rice fields. They were not soldiers in the sense the world expected. They were clerks, nurses, typists, and orderlies who had followed the rising sun into the Pacific, told by their superiors that their service was as vital as any man's rifle. Now, stripped of certainty and standing in enemy custody, they were little more than ghosts of an empire collapsing behind them. They were prisoners, but worse, they were women taught to believe that captivity was a fate more shameful than death. Every propaganda pamphlet, every whispered warning had painted the Americans as monsters. They would dishonor you, humiliate you, break you. And so, as they waited under the relentless tropical sky, their silence was not only fear but anticipation of a horror they had been told was inevitable. The American guards who watched them from the shade of the palms could not have looked more foreign. Tall, broad-shouldered, their khaki shirts darkened with sweat, they carried themselves with a careless confidence, rifles slung with the ease of men who no longer expected battle. To the women, these men seemed carved out of another world entirely. They laughed easily, their English sounding like bursts of gravel and music, sharp consonants blending with slow drawls. One of the soldiers tipped back his canteen and let the last drops splash into his mouth, sighing with such theatrical relief that even his comrades chuckled. The women did not smile. They stared at the dirt or at their feet, waiting for cruelty to begin. What they did not know was that the Americans themselves were caught in an unspoken contradiction. They had fought a war where their enemy was faceless, often depicted in caricatured leaflets as fanatics or beasts. Yet here, standing before them, were women not unlike the sisters or wives they had left back home. Their fear was palpable, stitched into every downcast eye and trembling hand. For the soldiers, hardened by Guadalcanal, Saipan, and countless names that had become graveyards, there was something unsettling in this quiet row of women who looked at them as though expecting the worst crime. The war had made them killers, but in that humid clearing, they were being asked to play another role entirely. The ground itself seemed to share in the tension. Dust lifted at each step, hanging briefly before vanishing into the heavy air. The women's sandals, worn to near nothing, cut lines into their swollen feet. Hunger gnawed at them. Rations were meager, and their stomachs tightened at the smell of the soldiers' mess kit where the ghost of yesterday's coffee lingered. Sweat trickled down the Americans' necks, soaking collars, while the women tried not to sway in the heat that pressed on their skulls like iron. Every breath was an effort, every moment a reminder of the gulf that yawned between captor and captive. Still, the hours dragged on without punishment, without the brutality they had been told to expect. Days earlier, when they were first herded into camp, some had whispered to one another, was this delay a cruelty in itself, a waiting before the storm? But nothing came except food, meager yet edible, water that was clean, and orders barked with firmness but not malice. The strangeness of it gnawed at their certainties. Fear thrives on clarity. What unnerves most is when the script fails to match reality. One of the younger nurses, scarcely more than 19, dared a glance upward. She saw not monsters but men slouched against their rifles, wiping their brows, muttering about the heat. One picked at a harmonica tucked into his breast pocket, letting slip a note that startled the cicadas into a brief silence before they roared back louder. The tune hung in the air like a question that no one dared answer. The girl lowered her gaze again, ashamed of her curiosity, yet something inside her cracked, the faintest splinter in the wall of propaganda she had carried. The river, just beyond the clearing, ran low and sluggish in the season, its brown surface broken by shafts of sunlight. The smell of water drifted toward them, mingling with the tang of sweat and rusted metal. For the women, it was both salvation and torment, the promise of relief so close, yet unreachable under watchful eyes. One soldier knelt to fill his helmet with water and poured it over his head, groaning with pleasure as the droplets cascaded down his face. His comrades jeered, but there was envy in their laughter. The women pressed their lips tighter. They had been trained to endure thirst, to bite back need, but the sight of cool water against hot skin carved longing deep into their throats. Somewhere in the foliage a bird cried out, sharp and lonely, as though mocking the fragile truce of silence. The moment passed, but the dissonance remained. Here stood women who believed they were condemned to unspeakable humiliation. Here lounged soldiers who, for all their easy confidence, carried scars of battles too fresh to name. The war had thrown them together in this improbable tableau, neither side knowing how to bridge the gulf of expectation. And then, as the sun climbed higher, as the heat pressed down like a physical weight, something shifted. A murmur passed between the soldiers, glances traded, a shrug, a chuckle. The women caught only fragments, but they felt the current change, subtle and unnerving. The Americans looked toward the river, then back at them, and smiled with a casualness that struck like lightning. Words were spoken, slow, deliberate, accompanied by gestures. The message was simple, almost absurd in its strangeness. They were being invited to the water. For a heartbeat the clearing held its breath. The cicadas droned, the river gurgled, the sweat rolled, but all else froze. The women blinked in disbelief, their bodies stiff with suspicion. Was this kindness, mockery, or a prelude to something darker? The soldiers, however, seemed unconcerned, pointing again at the river with an openness that defied malice. It was an invitation no one could have imagined, and in that instant the world tilted, leaving them balanced on the edge of a decision that would append everything they thought they knew about their enemy. At first, no one moved. The women stood frozen, their arms stiff against their sides, eyes darting between the soldiers and the riverbank. The Americans gestured again, pointing toward the water with exaggerated movements, their smiles meant to be reassuring but landing like riddles. The guards stepped back a little, giving the women space as though to prove they meant no harm. Yet suspicion gripped the captives like iron. For women raised in a culture where modesty was armor and surrender was shame, the idea of entering the water under the gaze of enemy men felt like stepping into a trap. The river itself whispered seduction. Its surface rippled with sunlight, the smell of damp earth and cool currents rising with every breeze. Sweat clung to the women's backs, their throats parched, their heads light from the relentless heat. The youngest among them, the same nurse who had dared glance at the soldiers before, felt her body scream for relief even as her mind warned her to resist. She remembered the whispered warnings from officers before capture. Americans would strip you of dignity first, then life. The contradiction left her trembling, suspended between thirst and fear. One soldier, a lanky private with freckles burned red by the sun, tapped his chest and shook his head emphatically. Then he turned his back toward the women, spreading his arms as if to say, "See? No tricks." His comrades laughed at his theatrics, but the gesture carried weight. Another soldier, perhaps sensing the gulf of mistrust, placed his rifle carefully against a tree and stepped back, palms open. To the women it was a startling sight, a signal that challenged everything they had braced themselves to endure. They exchanged furtive glances, their eyes flicking like sparrows caught in a storm. Finally, one of the older women, her hair streaked with gray beneath the sweat-matted kerchief, lifted her chin. She whispered something sharp and quick, a command rather than a plea. Two others shifted forward uncertainly. Their sandals scraped against the dirt as they edged toward the river, each step both a betrayal of fear and a gamble with fate. The guard said nothing, only watched, one of them humming faintly under his breath as if to keep the mood light. The women paused at the bank, staring at the muddy shallows. The water beckoned like a forbidden gift. Cloth rustled. Hesitantly, they removed their outer tunics, keeping their undergarments on, clinging to whatever modesty they could salvage. The Americans turned their heads politely, though a few stole glances with the clumsy curiosity of young men long deprived of familiar company. There was no jeering, no laughter. Instead, one soldier muttered in his own tongue, almost reverent, as though surprised that these so-called enemies were simply women, fragile and ordinary in their exhaustion. The women's hearts thudded in their chests. Every second felt like a gamble with humiliation, but no cruelty came. The first to touch the river was the young nurse. She dipped her hand into the current, startled by the cool rush that licked her skin. A gasp escaped her lips before she could stop it, and the sound rippled through the silence like a spark. She waded deeper, water rising past her calves, then her knees. Her body trembled, but not from fear. This was relief, pure and unguarded. The others followed, awkward at first, their movements stiff, as though expecting at any moment for the illusion to shatter. But the soldiers kept their distance, standing along the bank, watching with an odd mix of vigilance and gentleness. The women crouched low in the shallows, splashing water over their faces, their arms, their necks. Some closed their eyes, lips parting as if drinking in freedom itself. The smell of river mud, sharp and mineral, clung to them, mixing with the salt of their sweat. Their laughter, hesitant at first, broke free in whispers and giggles, quickly muffled by hands pressed to mouths as if laughter itself were forbidden. Yet the sound carried, delicate but undeniable, floating into the air above the drone of cicadas. The soldiers stiffened at the unexpected music of it, then one of them chuckled, a deep rumble that startled even his companions. For a heartbeat, enemies shared a rhythm of mirth. Numbers could not capture this moment, yet history presses them into the margins. By August of 1945, over 300,000 Japanese troops and civilians had fallen into Allied hands across the Pacific, though women were only a fraction of that number. Their stories, scattered in diaries and rare testimonies, often went untold. What happened along that river was not in official records, but in memory, an anecdote whispered decades later, preserved by those who could not forget the day fear collided with kindness. The older woman, still waist-deep in water, straightened her shoulders. She had lived through air raids, shortages, and the crushing certainty of defeat. Now, as she splashed water across her brow, she felt the weight of contradiction. The Americans did not leer, did not harm, did not even demand gratitude. They simply stood guard, as though protecting her from some unseen threat. A strange irony bloomed inside her chest. Safety, coming from the very enemy who had destroyed her world. On the bank, the freckled private shaded his eyes, watching the current swirl around the women. He grinned lopsidedly and muttered to his comrade, "Hell, they look happier than we've been all week." His friend snorted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Wish Command would let us take a dip too," he said, and the others laughed quietly. The remark was simple, almost foolish, yet it carried a truth that bent the air between them. In that moment, thirst and heat were enemies shared on both sides of the war. The young nurse felt the river cradle her like an old friend. She tilted her face upward, letting the sunlight scatter across droplets on her skin. The fear had not vanished. She still expected the worst to return at any moment. But for now the water was real, the relief undeniable. She glanced toward the soldiers, half expecting cruelty to burst from their rifles. Instead, she found their gazes averted, their postures steady. They were not monsters. They were men keeping watch. What began as suspicion had turned into something far more bewildering. The women, once rigid in shame, now let themselves drift in the current, if only a little, their bodies lighter than they had felt in months. And though they would not admit it aloud, some carried the dangerous thought that perhaps the river was not just cooling their skin, it was washing away a sliver of the lies they had been told. As the sun slid higher and the cicadas screamed louder, one soldier adjusted his rifle strap and looked toward the horizon, uneasy. The women's laughter, now unguarded, carried through the trees. It was beautiful, but it was also fragile, as though any sudden sound could shatter it. He knew war was not done with them yet, not here, not anywhere. And he wondered, as the current rushed past, how long this improbable peace could last before the river carried it all away. The river soon became more than water. It became a stage where fear and mistrust softened into something neither side could quite name. At first, the women clung to the banks, careful not to drift too far from solid ground. Their movements were hesitant, shoulders hunched, eyes darting to make sure the Americans were keeping their promise of distance. But the current coaxed them gently forward, and when one stumbled and splashed, the others laughed. Startled, tentative laughter that sounded like cracks in a wall long thought unbreakable. That laughter lingered, echoed, and then multiplied, as if the river itself had drawn it out from their chests. The soldiers heard it too, and for a moment they forgot themselves as guards. One leaned his rifle against a palm and wiped his forehead, grinning at the sound. It had been years since he had heard women laugh without calculation or fear, years since the jungle and the gunfire had drowned out anything light or human. Now the sound seemed almost holy, like church bells in the middle of a battlefield. His comrades exchanged glances, half amusement, half disbelief. These women had been painted as shadows of fanaticism, yet here they were, splashing each other with childlike abandon. The young nurse, emboldened by the ripple of laughter, ducked beneath the surface and re-emerged with water clinging to her hair like strands of glass. She blinked against the sun and found herself smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in months. The older woman beside her scolded her softly for her boldness, but even she could not suppress the curve of her lips as she rubbed river water against her neck. It was impossible not to surrender to the relief, if only for an hour. The Americans kept their word. They stood guard with a curious reverence, rifles held but pointed nowhere, their gazes drifting respectfully away from the women's bathing forms. One soldier produced a cigarette and lit it, exhaling smoke that curled like incense into the humid air. He offered another to his comrade, who shook his head and muttered, "Don't ruin the moment." The irony of such words, spoken by a man who had killed and seen killing, was not lost on him. But war teaches strange lessons. Sometimes the most fragile silence feels more valuable than victory itself. It was here, on this muddy bank, that the contradictions of the war surfaced in stark relief. Japanese soldiers in American custody had often been defiant to the point of self-destruction, some choosing suicide rather than capture. Women had been warned endlessly that surrender would mean dishonor worse than death. And yet, this scene unfolded in complete defiance of those grim prophecies. Laughter rose where silence was expected. Trust flickered where terror had been drilled. The irony was not lost on the Americans either. They remembered how their comrades had suffered in Japanese camps, beaten, starved, reduced to skeletons. The cruelty of that memory lingered, and yet here they were, offering mercy to women who might once have served those very camps. One soldier muttered under his breath, "The world's upside down," and another replied, "Maybe that's the only way it ever makes sense." Their exchange drifted into the drone of cicadas, unnoticed by the women, but it marked the unease beneath the moment's beauty. For all its warmth, this was still a fragile truce balanced on the knife edge of war. The river's coolness transformed the women's bodies as much as their spirits. Color returned to their cheeks, their eyes brightened, and their movements grew freer. One began humming a melody, faint at first, then louder as the others joined in. It was not a song the Americans recognized, but its cadence was lilting, almost like a lullaby. The soldiers listened, stilled by the foreign yet soothing tune, until one whistled a counter-melody from back home, "You Are My Sunshine." For a heartbeat, two worlds overlapped in music, woven together not by politics or strategy but by rhythm and breath. The women blinked at the sound, surprised but not offended, and their laughter bubbled again, carrying the song into the heat. Facts linger in the background of such scenes like unwelcome ghosts. Allied reports documented that Japanese captives, especially women, often struggled to reconcile their expectations of barbarity with the relative fairness they encountered. American military records boasted of low mortality rates among their prisoners, less than 2%, an unimaginable contrast to the 30% death toll in Japanese camps. Numbers like these told of systems, of policies. But here, on the riverbank, numbers dissolved into something messier and more human. The collision of fear with kindness, suspicion with care. The young nurse drifted further into the current, letting the water carry her a few feet before she steadied herself. She looked back at the soldiers on the bank, her brow furrowed, as if searching for the cruelty she had been promised. She found instead one of them smiling faintly, not with hunger but with the softness of recognition, as though she reminded him of someone back home. She felt her throat tighten, startled by the ache of being seen as a person rather than an enemy. It was dangerous to believe in such a look, yet she could not erase it from her mind. The older woman caught her expression and shook her head. She knew the war was not done, knew mercy could vanish in an instant. But even she felt her guard weakening as the sun warmed her face and the river soothed her skin. For the first time since their capture, she considered the possibility that survival might not be worse than death. The soldiers, too, wrestled with contradictions. They thought of their comrades who had never returned, of the brutality meted out on Americans in places like Bataan. And yet, when they saw these women laughing, they could not summon hatred. The sound was too familiar, too human. It disarmed them more effectively than any weapon. As the afternoon deepened, the river became a chorus of splashes, songs, and half-hidden smiles. Time seemed to stretch, unmoored from the war's usual urgency. But beneath the surface of this fleeting peace, The current carried something heavier. Both sides knew the war's violence could intrude at any moment. Both sides felt the weight of lies unraveling, thread by thread, in the unlikeliest of places. And so, as the sun slid toward the treetops and shadows began to lengthen, the laughter on the riverbank reached its peak. Bright, bewildering, impossible to reconcile with the world beyond the jungle. It was beautiful, and it was fragile. Because just as the women began to believe they might be safe, and just as the soldiers dared to see them as more than prisoners, a rustle in the distance reminded them that the war was not finished, and that even rivers could not wash everything clean. The river eventually released them back to the shore, dripping and quiet, their clothes clinging, their hair darkened and heavy. The laughter that had rung out so strangely between captives and guards now hung in the air like smoke after a fire, fading but unforgettable. The women stepped onto the bank with hesitant dignity, pulling tunics over damp underclothes, casting furtive glances at the Americans who still stood watch. Nothing had been taken from them, nothing dishonored, and that absence itself felt shocking. They had been prepared for cruelty, but instead they had been handed something rarer, reprieve. The current of the river had carried away not just sweat and grime, but a small piece of the fear that had shackled their hearts. That night, as the jungle sang with the shrill chorus of insects, the women lay on bamboo mats beneath a canvas shelter provided by their captors. The air was still thick, but cooler now, and the scent of damp earth clung to them. They whispered in low voices, careful not to wake the guards nearby. One woman admitted she had almost wept when the water touched her skin. Another confessed that she had expected the soldiers to jeer or lunge, and that the very absence of such behavior was harder to comprehend than cruelty would have been. They spoke of home, of mothers who would never believe this story, of the strange gentleness of men they had been told were wolves. The young nurse, who had been the first to step into the river, listened more than she spoke, but she traced the memory of the soldier's fleeting smile in her mind, unable to release it. The Americans had their own reflections. Around a small fire, they sat smoking and trading muttered remarks about the day. One admitted he felt guilty watching them splash, as if he had intruded on something too private. Another said he hadn't heard laughter like that since his sister's wedding back home, and the memory had twisted his chest with longing. They all knew men who had been beaten and starved in Japanese camps, and yet, when faced with these women, they could not summon vengeance. Instead, they felt the strange ache of recognition, that enemies were not always faceless, and that humanity had a way of slipping past the barbed wire of ideology. The war would soon end, though none of them knew exactly when. News filtered in slowly, rumors carried on the breath of officers. Japan's navy broken, cities burning under firestorms, whispers of a weapon so powerful it could end everything in a flash of light. The women clutched at fragments of hope and dread, uncertain whether their homeland still existed as they remembered it. The soldiers spoke of going home, of farms waiting in Kansas, of sweethearts who had stopped writing, of bars in New York where the beer would taste like victory. Yet even in their talk of endings, the memory of the river day lingered. It had carved a place inside them, sharp and undeniable, like a scar that both hurt and healed. Years later, when the world had turned and the guns were silent, some of the women told their stories. In post-war Japan, where shame still weighed heavily, not all dared to speak of captivity. But a few recounted the strangeness of that summer day, the unbearable heat, the river that beckoned, the Americans who stepped back instead of forward. One remembered the sound of cicadas rising like a drum roll as she entered the water. Another remembered the laughter, startling in its simplicity, rising from her throat before she could silence it. For them, it was a memory sharper than many battles, not of death, but of an unexpected grace. For the soldiers, too, fragments endured. Decades after, some recalled the odd afternoon when war had seemed to pause, when enemies became women washing in a river while they kept guard like awkward brothers. The memory was bittersweet, for it stood in contrast to the cruelty they had both seen and endured elsewhere. It was proof that the war was never one thing, that within its firestorms were moments of water, small reprieves that refused to be extinguished. The young nurse, who had been barely 19 then, lived long enough to tell her grandchildren of that day. She never named the soldier whose smile had startled her, never claimed more than what was given, but she spoke of the river as though it had been alive. She said it had carried away fear, if only for an hour, and given her strength to survive the long years after. The older woman, hardened by war, told no such stories aloud, but when she washed clothes in a stream, she sometimes paused, staring at the water as though it whispered something only she could hear. The river itself outlasted them all, winding through jungle and soil long after uniforms rotted and rifles rusted. Its current had carried bodies in wartime, had borne the weight of destruction, but it had also carried laughter, brief, fragile, unforgettable. The memory of that sound clung like mist, invisible but present, reminding those who had witnessed it that even in the most merciless conflict, humanity could surface in the most improbable of places. In the end, the war was remembered in numbers. Millions dead, cities erased, nations remade. Yet the river's memory resisted numbers. It lived in the hidden corners of diaries, in the soft tremor of a survivor's voice, in the uneasy silence of a soldier who could not reconcile the cruelty he had seen with the kindness he had given. It became a symbol of contradiction, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, the possibility of mercy flowed just beneath the surface. And so the story closes not on gunfire or surrender papers, but on water glinting beneath the sun, carrying ripples outward into history. For the women who entered it, the river was both danger and salvation, humiliation and relief. For the men who guarded them, it was a mirror reflecting back their own humanity. The current bound them together for an afternoon, and when it released them, they carried that weight into the rest of their lives. The river did not change the war, but it changed them, and that was its quiet victory. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.